Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well. I am so happy to be sharing this painting process with you today because it's a painting that I'm really proud of. One of my goals for this year is to get better at gouache. I feel like I know a little bit about it because I have used it a bit, but I'm not fully confident working with it yet, and I could really do with some more practice. Similarly to oil paint, I like a very blocky look with visible brush strokes and unblended colors, and it doesn't come quite natural to me just yet, just because I haven't had as much practice with it. But I really put a lot of effort into this piece to achieve the look that I wanted, and I think it came out really well in the end, and I learned a lot from this process. So the thing about gouache is that it has a really intense dry shift, which means colors dry differently from what you see on the palette, and usually dark tones will dry lighter and light tones will dry darker. So first of all, it's harder to achieve high contrast pieces because everything tends to become a mid-tone. But also, it's really confusing when you're painting, especially if you're not used to it, because you're never quite sure what the color is going to look like when it dries, and sometimes it works out and sometimes it just makes an absolute mess. And I think with practice you do become more skilled in predicting what the final result would be, but I haven't been using gouache for a while, and overall I just don't have a lot of experience with it, so it's something that I struggled with throughout this process quite a lot, especially towards like the second half, I would say, when I was using really opaque paint, because the dry shift is definitely more evident when the paint isn't diluted. So as you will see in a moment, the reference I chose was quite an interesting one, light and color-wise. You might remember I did a drawing of Jensen Ackles from the Radio Company concert a couple of weeks ago. Loved how that one came out. And while I was looking for references for that drawing, I also stumbled upon this one, and I kind of saved it for later. And then at Christmas, I got a new watercolor sketchbook and gouache set, both of which I'm using in this video. The set I got is the Arteza one, which has 60 colors, which is amazing. Wonderful color selection. And I was going through all of them and trying to put together different color palettes, and I came up with this one that reminded me of that photo I'd saved, and so I ended up painting it. The colors are not exactly the same. I went for more of a lilac purple lighting instead of a bright blue one, but I really liked how the end result looked with the peachy yellow warm tones that I was also using, so I'm really happy I went for it. But this reference really had some very interesting lighting, both in terms of contrast and also in terms of the actual color of the light. Half of his face is lit up with bright blue light and the other half is very warm toned, so I started with the warm tones because it's what I'm most confident and comfortable with, and then I moved on to the cooler tone side, which is really interesting to work with, especially when it comes to skin. But I think through some struggles and some, questionable parts, like right now it looks very patchy. I promise I do fix it in a moment. I think overall it ended up working out in the end, and I'm really happy about that. The thing about having this many colors is that you don't have to mix as much because you already have the colors that you need, or very similar ones, and therefore you don't need to add as much water to make your paint fluid enough for mixing. So I actually found it a lot easier to keep my paint creamy and not water it down too much, which made this process a lot more enjoyable. And I actually didn't use that many more colors than I used to when I was working with a primary palette of like 6 colors, I think. I think in this case I used a total of 11 colors, but I was able to use them either straight from the tube or do a very minimal amount of mixing to get the color that I needed, which was wonderful. And it was actually a really interesting exercise as well, because in this case, when you do end up mixing colors, you're not just adding primaries, you're adding other colors, and you don't really know how those will affect your mix. I feel like being used to working with primaries, I can visualize very easily what will happen if I mix a certain color with another, and so color mixing becomes very intuitive. But starting with different colors makes for a very interesting exercise, and it's something that I hadn't thought about before, but I actually really enjoyed it, and I'm excited to keep trying different color palettes from this set. So as you can definitely tell, the painting started out quite patchy, not in a good way, and it took a while for it to start looking all right. Even now, when I first start adding these dark tones, it looks very intense and creepy, but it's because the rest of it is still very muted and light, and I haven't really gone in with any dark tones at all. And this painting ends up having a black background, so I knew that was going to be the case, and I really needed to add in some of these dark tones. But when you first start doing that, it just looks a bit scary, and so as you're painting, it's also a bit scary because you don't really know where you're going with things, or at least I didn't, because I'm really not used to working this way. So it was very interesting, but it took a while overall to get over the ugly stage, I guess. And as I started using thicker and more opaque paint, it sort of, fixed itself. And being used to mostly working with oils, it's really interesting to see how using a different medium leads to kind of a different process. I feel like I still approached it in a very similar way, going from thin and like diluted watery layers to thick paint, but the results both at the end and like in the various middle stages are very different, and I really, really love seeing that. I will say I struggled a bit with likeness in this painting, and about halfway through I was waiting for things to dry, and I took a picture of the painting and I overlapped it with the reference that I was using, and then I used this comparison to adjust some of the proportions that weren't quite right, like the chin and the ear. And it's definitely a method that I recommend if you're ever struggling with this. It was very, very helpful for me. I made the chin a bit too small, so I kind of brought that forward a bit. The ear was just kind of moved a centimeter to the right, so I fixed that as well. And I made kind of the back of the head a bit too small, so I also fixed that. And it made a really, really big difference, but it's a lot easier to tell that way than it is if you're just looking at the two pictures separately. So I definitely recommend that. And overall, I think the final result is okay. Like, it's recognizable enough, but it's not entirely accurate, and it's definitely not as recognizable as the drawing that I did in my sketchbook that I shared a few weeks ago. So I'm quite happy with it overall, but as with every piece, there are definitely things that could be improved as well. Overall, the piece took about an hour and a half, which I split over 2 days. I did just a little over an hour the first day, and then I came back to it the next day for maybe another 20 minutes or so to finish it. I would honestly have been pretty happy leaving it as it was at the end of the first session, but I wanted to add some details first of all. I wanted to uniform the background, which I thought it was quite interesting having it fade from black to this pale yellow, but logically it didn't really make sense, and I thought overall having a fully black background would just be better. And at this point I also hadn't used white yet at all. I was using a really pale yellow to lighten up any colors that needed it, but I hadn't even put white onto my palette at all. And so I thought to finish the piece I would just add some slightly more intense highlights, and also I added some details with bronze metallic paint. There's a few metallic colors in the set that I'm quite curious to try out because they look very beautiful in the tube and I've swatched them out and they're really cool, but I thought this bronze would go best with the color palette that I was going for in this piece, and in the end I'm happy I used it. I think it added a nice element of interest to the background and gave the painting a bit more character, which I really like. So that's about it for this piece. I hope you enjoyed watching this painting process. There will definitely be more gouache paintings in the next few weeks because I'm really enjoying it and I have a lot of ideas for it. So I'd love to know your thoughts on the piece. But with that being said, thank you so much for watching. I wish you a lovely week and I will see you soon with a new video.